got a phone number here. Thank you to everyone for introducing themselves. Welcome to Roles and Responsibilities in the Municipal Planning Process. So I anticipate I'll have maybe a half an hour, 40 minutes of presentation, and then I'll have time for questions in between each of the sections, or feel free to pop them in the chat, and then also at the end. And just confirming you're seeing the full screen of the presentation right now. Hopefully. Please someone let me know if that's not the case. So today we'll be going over some of the basics of what is planning, the board roles and responsibilities, municipal plans and public engagements, and a brief overview of some of the ways that you can implement the municipal plan. So we'll start with just a general overview of what planning is and its statutory basis in Vermont. We plan because virtually everything we do in our lives is planned. In our personal lives, for example, we plan for everything from what we're going to make for dinner that night to when we will retire and how. At the community level, we have things like the economy, climate, and disasters, and private development plans, changes in populations. We know in Vermont, for example, we have an aging population. And all of these things will change our communities, whether we plan for them or not. Planning allows us to develop a shared goal amongst our communities, and that allows us to respond to changes in a way that reflects those community goals, needs, and priorities and values. It allows us to ensure that we are making and strengthening great places to live, that we are making transparent decisions about how we go about regulating, investing, um, and otherwise operating to the public. And it helps us promote wise investments for the future so that we are prepared for what's coming to us. Planning is not new in Vermont. The Vermont legislature first authorized municipalities to create planning commissions and draft municipal plans way back in 1921, which is over 100 years ago. And it's a little less than 100 years for zoning regulations. Our modern laws were first created in 1968 with the Municipal and Regional Planning and Development Act. Um, and then those were substantially updated over the course of the last sort of 40 years from 1988, which were changes to the planning portions, 2004, which made substantial changes to the zoning portion. And then more recently, we've seen a number of changes that the state has made related to planning and zoning to promote housing growth. So you'll see a lot of state influence here, and I think that's one of the important things to understand about planning in Vermont, which is that in Vermont, it's what's called the Dillon's Rule state, which means that what the town can regulate is set out based on state law. So the state basically builds the boundaries of the box, and the municipality works within that. So these state laws set out how towns can plan and what impacts those plans can have. One of the things the state sets out is these broad planning process goals, which are the overall goals for how the planning process should work. And these really involve ensuring that the planning process is comprehensive, that it's coordinated across all levels. So you'll notice one of the things that would be in your municipal plan is looking at how that relates to the plans of other municipalities in the region, that it involves widespread public participation, and we'll talk a bit more about how you can support public participation in your planning further down the line in this presentation, that it considers how to best use resources and guide growth, and that it allows municipalities to work together to meet common goals. So these really broad planning process goals speak to some of the recommendations and actions that we'll talk about further in terms of how you can plan and support good planning process in your municipality. So before we talk a little bit more about the planning, actually, sorry, I'll pause there if there's any questions. And you feel free to put them in the chat or just unmute yourself. Great. So before we move into more of what planning is, just a brief overview of who in a municipality is involved in planning. So much like you probably learned in some class in high school, that there are different branches of our federal government, there are also sort of different branches within the planning and zoning of our municipal government. There are legislative functions, which are those that make and write policies and regulations and plans. There's the quasi-judicial function. These are boards that look at um, review of specific applications and try to apply things like your zoning regulations. There's administrative, which is implementing in a non-discretionary way your regulations and rules. And then there's also in many towns, advisory functions, which are things like conservation commissions, energy committees, that don't have a direct role in writing policies and plans, but may advise on those. So these different groups also have different ways that they are appointed. So for the case of the select board or also village trustees and a city council, those are elected by voters at town meeting. On the other hand, planning commission, development review board, and zoning board of adjustment members in most communities are appointees appointed by the select board. However, in some communities, they may be voted on at town meeting, and you may have to actually run for that office. So that's just a difference. And then the zoning administrator is appointed based on a nomination from the planning commission and an appointment from the select board. So even though that's a staff position, it is actually an appointed position. So the legislative functions of the planning commissions are that they are the only entity that is responsible for preparing the town plan. And they also are responsible for preparing zoning and subdivision bylaws and amendments if your community has zoning and subdivision. And they have a mandatory role in those two processes, with the exception of temporary bylaw or emergency bylaws. So your planning commission has to be involved in your town plan and your zoning and subdivision bylaws. There's also a number of functions in which the Planning Commission is not required to be involved, but they can be, which include preparing capital budgets and programs, preparing other ordinances. So those can be things like some communities have a parking ordinance or an ordinance on short-term rentals, um, or other similar sort of ordinances. Junk and trash is another common ordinance that the Planning Commission can be involved with. And then other studies as well as the direction of the Select Board. So many communities have done transportation or streetscape planning or specific area planning for village master planning, for example. These are all the types of studies that a planning commission can be involved with. The select board, or in some cases, a city council or village trustees, in cases where there isn't joint planning, uh, is responsible for reviewing the town plan submitted by the planning commission. They may make edits to that plan. And in most communities, they adopt the plans, or in some communities, they send it for voter approval. And similarly with zoning and subdivision bylaws, they review, make edits, and either adopt or send to the voters for approval, depending on how your municipality chooses to do it. Because the Commission and Select Board share these functions of preparing and adopting the town plan and zoning and subdivision, it's very important that those two bodies have regular communication during the preparation of any town plan or zoning bylaw amendments. Essentially, if you work on a planning commission and you're working really hard on your plan or on your zoning bylaws, only to find out that your select board actually doesn't support those changes at all, you've just spent a lot of time working on something that isn't going to get adopted. So oftentimes it can be a great practice to at least at the start of those sort of edit processes, especially schedule a joint meeting of your planning commission and select board, warn it for both bodies, and really make sure that everyone is, if not on the same page, is at least on a similar page and is understanding what can be supported in the town and what can't. Um, Also, in terms of zoning bylaw adoption, previously the voters themselves in rural towns, could require the zoning bylaw be sent to the voters. Um, and this has changed. Now it is solely the responsibility of the select board or other legislative body, so city council or trustees, to decide whether or not they want to send their bylaws to the vote for the public. So that's a change that happened recently. The select board also is responsible for preparing, amending, and adopting capital budgets if your municipality has a capital budget, and other ordinances. In terms of those review of the development itself, in some communities that does involve planning commissions, and in some communities it doesn't. So in the development review board model, a single board reviews all aspects of development review, including site plans, subdivisions, conditional uses, variances, waivers, and appeals of ZA decisions. In a split model, the Zoning Board of Adjustment reviews conditional use reviews, variances and waivers, and appeals of ZA decisions, but the Planning Commission also plays a role in reviewing site plans and subdivisions. Generally, we recommend that communities move to a development review board model as it allows for a more efficient and coordinated review process, is less confusing for applicants who would otherwise have to split their application between two boards. And because you are allowed to completely overlap membership of the Development Review Board and the Planning Commission. So if you um, have planning commissioners who are really want to make sure they continue doing site plan and subdivision review, they can also become members of the Development Review Board. And in fact, in some communities, they are essentially one board with two functions. So. And then finally, you have your advisory committees and commissions. These are entities that may provide input on the town plan. In some communities, they may also be part of the bylaw review process. For example, some communities have design advisory committees that provide input to the DRB on development within a town's historic district. But these bodies are advisory and they don't have that ability to make final decisions regarding land use applications or regarding the town plan. And then you have your zoning administrator, if you're in a town that has zoning and subdivision regulations. Um, Zoning administrators respond to the questions from residents, property owners, and developers. They coordinate review of application. Um, they review applications which are permitted uses to issues or deny zoning permits, and conduct zoning enforcement. And in many communities, they may also serve as a clerk to municipal boards. Um, and in some municipalities are also authorized to do certain other types of development review, such as review of minor subdivisions. So again, those functions can vary based on the town. These are some additional resources. We'll send this out afterwards as well, where you can find information on these different groups, as well as the for zoning administrators, the full zoning administrators handbook, which covers many common types of development review challenges you may face. I'm going to stop again there for a minute in case there are any questions. Great. Not seeing any in the chat. So now we can talk a little bit about the actual process of developing and updating your municipal plan and public engagement. So as we talked about a little bit at the beginning, municipal plans are a long-term vision for what the future of your community will be like. When we write a municipal plan, we're really thinking not just a few years in the future, but what will the community look like in 20 and 50 years in the future? And what do we need to do today to reach that goal? Whether or not you plan, things will change in your community, but plans help you respond to the change and guide your future in a way those meet your community priority. It also provides a stable source of information and a roadmap for the future that can be really useful, especially as board membership and staff change. It serves as a written document that talks about why you picked those goals and why you moved in the direction you did. Municipal plans have to be updated every 8 years, although they can be amended more frequently if you have an urgent issue that arises. In general, we can view the planning process as essentially a 5-step process. And the scale of each plan update will sort of depend on what your community need is, how recently you've done a major update of your plan, and as well as the budget you have available. For example, do you have a grant or a municipal budget for the update, or is it relatively small? But as a general rule, you're going to start by assessing what's happening in your community. There's so much data and information out there and available, data from the Census, American Community Survey, data from state sources about unemployment and businesses. The housing data dashboard is a really great data on housing. And you can use this to assess what's happening in your community. What are the trends we're seeing? What are the changes? What are the challenges we're experiencing? And based on that, you're going to develop a shared vision for the future. What should we preserve in our community? What should we change? What challenges do we need to address? And this allows you to identify shared goals, objectives, and map current and future needs. That can look like land uses, community facilities, community utilities, transportation networks, roads, bridges, sidewalks, and identify actions, which are discrete actions that you can take within the next 8 years that will further the vision and goals of your plan. And in between those 8 year plan cycles, it usually takes a year or maybe sometimes 2 years to do your actual plan update. Uh, so in that kind of 5 to 6 year period in between, you should review your plan's action items. You can implement the plan and review what needs to maybe change next time. You might have set up something as a priority action item and then realize that it's not feasible or actually the community has moved in a different direction. So you continuously review your plan, and that helps you prepare for your next plan update. So what does having a municipal plan actually enable you to do beyond just being a valuable step for planning for the future? Well, first, if you have zoning and want to have zoning and subdivision regulations, in order to have zoning and subdivision or to continue to amend them, if you currently have them, you need to maintain a municipal plan. And zoning and subdivision regulations should essentially be based on the vision of the plan and the goals and implement the municipal plan. The plan also gets looked at certain state review process, for example, the Act 250 review process, as well as Section 248 review. Section 248 and 248A include things like energy generation, such as wind and solar facilities, and telecommunications equipment, such as cellular towers. Some state grants will also give priority to communities with plans or might look to your plan to see if a project is listed. So it's a great opportunity to list projects that you'd like to get done in that plan as a way of showing that you've been planning ahead. It can also support decision making if you have a capital plan or budget. And it can also support other plans and infrastructure projects that your community is doing. So what is actually included in your plan? There are 12 required elements for each plan. Again, this comes from state statute. Three of these really relate to the overall structure of the plan. Your plan has to have objectives and policies. It has to have a plan for the implementation, essentially the actions you're going to do. And it has to discuss how the plan relates to the plans of adjacent municipalities and the region. Then there are 9 specific planning topic areas that the plan has to address. So these look at things like what is the infrastructure in your community? Do you have a water system? What are the road systems like? Educational facilities, so schools, transportation, land use. What's the current land use? What's the plan for land use? Natural and historic resources, uh, energy, housing, economic development, and flood resilience. So there are really specific subcategories under each of these that need to be addressed. And definitely, if you're working on a plan, if you're not already working with your regional planning commission or a consultant who's used to doing plans, always feel free to reach out to us to make sure we can review drafts and provide more information on the required elements of the plan. So these are the elements all plans must have. In addition to the 12 required elements of the plan, there are 15 statewide planning goals. Um, Plans which meet these statewide planning goals are eligible for regional approval, which provides benefits such as being eligible for the Municipal Planning Grant Program, being eligible for state designation programs beyond the Step 1 Center. So, for example, Step 2 Center and neighborhood designation programs, and the ability to have impact fees. These are broad goals that communities can be in different ways. For example, having compact centers followed by working lands and rural lands, and having available recreational opportunities, being resilient to flood, wise use of natural resources, protecting air, water, and wildlife quality, and all relate to having a vibrant and sustainable community. So these are broad planning goals that there's many different ways that you can meet them within your plan while also reflecting, what might be different community priorities. So that's what's in your plan, but how do you actually make your plan? Well, what's most important is ensuring that you have that the plan is your community's plan and vision. And we have this quote, when it comes to planning, if you're not doing it with people, they think you are doing it to them. Um, we can conceive of participation as sort of a spectrum, starting with just sort of informing people of what's happening and moving towards more and more public participation in the process. When updating your plan, you should consider the level of participation needed. And it might not be the same for all plan updates. All plans should be informed by community feedback at some level, but the level of participation can vary on many factors. For example, how recently have you done a major public outreach campaign? Um, when's the last time you did a big update of your plan versus a smaller update, as well as things like project budget, which are going to necessarily dictate how you can get this done. So at a minimum, all plan updates need to inform and consult with residents. So residents should be informed of the plan drafting. At a legal minimum, it needs to be in the agendas for the municipality and on the municipal website, as well as a public hearing warned. However, there are a lot of low-cost ways that you can improve this, because as we know, most people are not going on the municipal website or scouring the classified section of your local newspaper to find information about what's happening in their town. Um, so think about other low-cost ways you can get the word out, social media postings, a press release, if you have budget, a mailing, but also sometimes you can include information on a plan update in a mailing the town's already sending out, like a tax bill or a town meeting day information. And in small communities, even one-to-one casual conversations can really help get the word out that there is a plan update happening. Um, you should also consult with your residents. Again, as a legal minimum, you are required to have at least one hearing of the Planning Commission prior to adoption, and depending on the size of your municipality, one or two hearings for a select board. So for rural municipalities of under 2,500 people, that's one public hearing of the select board. And for urban municipalities of over 2,500 people, that's two public hearings of the select board. Um, and of course, you should allow for public comment at your meetings. However, it's also great to get public feedback before you're heading out to adopt your plan. And this can be done through things like surveys, open houses, and your survey can be as simple as, having some sort of open feedback form, whether that's a physical box with a card or an online option. Um, there are lots of free options out there as well to get feedback from the public. So for more involved updates, you can consider opportunities to involve and collaborate with the community. Uh, so, for example, holding a community workshop, which provides the opportunity to not only hear feedback, but also respond in real time. Identifying community organizations or groups that may have specific knowledge and experience. Hosting focus groups, particularly thinking about groups of folks that may have a really important perspective or may not have been involved in previous plan updates. And collaborate by inviting community members into coalitions and partnerships. Sometimes you can even create specialty advisory committees um, for your plan process. But remember that more is not only always more. Consider what information you actually need and can use in the plan and target your outreach accordingly. Um, if you try to ask every question you possibly could in a survey, for example, people are much less likely to fill it out than if you ask 5 or 10 questions that really get at the most important issues. Also, it's important to be honest with people about the process for approving the plan and to not overpromise how feedback will be used, but be honest about the decision-making process, the process of approving it through the Planning Commission and Select Board and to town vote if that's relevant for your community, and how the public input will be included in the plan. Um, so engaging people in planning should be fun. People want to do things that are fun and interesting. Um, So t all members of the community deserve to be part of the vision and think carefully about how you can make your planning process welcoming and reach as many folks as possible. Just talking to people can't be underrated enough, especially in small towns. It can alleviate fears, prevent understandings, and it's particularly useful to identify folks who uh, you think might be opposed to your project early on, and make sure that they're aware of what's happening and how they can be participate. For example, you could have each planning commissioner commit to talking with 10 people in town. It's also a great opportunity to engage trusted community leaders, um, to reach people who you may not have a direct contact with. Meeting people where there are can be a great way to get feedback. So you can go to places like senior centers, schools, farmers markets, or community events that are already ongoing, and ask for people feedback there. That way people aren't having to make the choice to spend their evening going to your planning session, but instead can participate in places where they already are and are already expecting to talk to their neighbors. Um, Similarly, having food, fun, and celebration, things like having a photo contest for your plan, having an open house with pizza or potluck snacks, having your event outdoors, for example, in the summer when it's nice out, maybe not so much in the winter, can all be great ways to make people more likely to attend. And then also think about if there are any barriers to participation and ways that you can help address them. For example, an easy way to having your event outdoors near a community park might make it more accessible to parents with young children who are able to not need childcare to attend, for example, because there's a safe place for their kid to play. Meet with local community groups, things like if you have a conservation commission or energy committee, you definitely want them to be involved, but also nonprofit groups, for example, like land trusts and watershed organizations. They can really provide helpful information, or economic development groups that can inform your plan update. And then just having an overall culture of communication, both in between different members of town government. So we talked before about the importance of communication between the select board and planning commission, and also with the general public. Use plain and non-inflammatory language to describe what you're doing. Um, Use tools like social media, web, and email to routinely inform people about town business, and generally support being the type of place in town where people can gather for all kinds of purposes, making your town hall usable and welcoming. There is a lot more information about the town plan process and how you can um, do some of these public engagement techniques in the Vermont Planning Manual Module 1, um, which is linked here in the presentation we'll send out after. Pausing again for any questions. Okay. Then I wanted to briefly talk about implementing the municipal plan. And this would go into a little bit of detail about zoning regulations, but if you really want to get more into the weeds about zoning regulations and the development review process, I highly recommend either attending or watching back the video of our presentation on May 28th, which will really focus on zoning and development review process. So within implementing the municipal plan can be split into two categories. One is a sort of regulatory implementation. Those are things like zoning and subdivision bylaws, also flood hazard bylaws, local ordinances. So for example, things like a short-term rental ordinance, and also official maps all fall within that category. And then there's other actions which are outside of the regulatory space. So things like making plans to improve and improving public facilities and utilities, developing a capital budget and plan, developing supplemental plans like village master plans, walking and biking plans, and streetscape plannings, and work with other commissions and committees. The plan itself also has some direct impacts with the policies and actions. It identifies the guiding principles that the municipality will follow, and it can guide town staff on how they should act to reach municipal goals. And it also has a direct role, as we've mentioned before, in the review of statewide permitting processes. So this is an area, Act 250, Section 248, and 248A. And as I've noted, your town plan also directly uh, implement is implemented by your zoning and subdivision regulations. Essentially, you can see the zoning and subdivision regulations as the regulatory implementation of the goals identified in your town plan. And you must have an active town plan to adopt or readopt bylaws. Uh, so just very briefly, some of the reasons that you might have land use regulations to implement these goals and visions. For example, if you're looking to promote compact walkable development in villages and downtowns, you can have zoning standards which allow for smaller lot sizes. In some cases, depending on the scale of community, require or encourage clustering of development and sidewalks, for example. You can protect important natural resources and farmland. Um, for example, through subdivision regulations that help protect forest and farmlands while also allowing for development and housing. Um, Encourage efficient use of infrastructure. This is especially true for communities that have things like a municipal water or a municipal sewer system, making sure that the areas where those systems are used efficiently. Encouraging safe pedestrian and vehicle traffic by looking at how those development can impact the types of traffic you're seeing and the way that it's um, moving through your community, and also flood resiliency. So having a flood hazard bylaw um, can ensure that you're not seeing new development in the floodplain and that you're encouraging existing development when it's being improved to include flood uh, resistant measures. So what are the types of things that you can regulate via zoning and subdivision regulations? Through zoning regulations, you can basically regulate construction, reconstruction, alteration of buildings and structures. Structures are one aspect that are regulated by zoning, and then zoning also regulates uses, so changes in uses of buildings or structures, land, and then also mining, excavation, and landfills. And then subdivision is generally regulated via is division of land into two or more parcels or the change of boundary between parcels. So these are all things that you can regulate within your zoning. And like I said, if you're interested in going into way more detail on the zoning side of it, I would highly recommend our May 20th presentation, but also happy to at the end of this presentation and answer any questions as well. So moving away now from talking about zoning and subdivision regulations, even without zoning and subdivision regulations, there are other ways that you can support implementation of your plan. One of the most common is additional plans and studies. I've referenced this a few times, but they can provide additional detail on items identified as action plans. Oftentimes, these can be areas where either you need more public outreach to prioritize improvements, or you need more dedicated support from a consultant, for example, to develop a cost estimate or an actual map of where things would go. So, for example, maybe you need to understand, where wetlands are, or how things can be developed within the right of way. Uh, and these are often funded by municipal planning grants. Um, the town plans also have a role in the new designation programs. So some of you may be familiar with the sort of older designation program, which was the village center designation program and the neighborhood development area and the downtown designations. So those have now changed to be the center and neighborhood designation. Um, And that's changed a little bit in terms of the way that the boundaries are mapped. So the boundaries are now based on the regional feature land use map, but your town plans have been used to basically determine those boundaries. And having a town plan is also required to receive a neighborhood designation, um, or to receive a step two center designation. And these provide benefits like the tax credit programs, priority for certain grants, and more. Having a plan also allows you to do capital plans and budgeting. Capital plans and budgeting means looking at over an extended period of time, such as 5 years, uh, a plan for what assets the municipality has, uh, and what their condition is, and when they'll need to be replaced. And then having a capital budget allows you to set aside money each year to pay for that cost. Um, this can be for things like municipal buildings, municipal vehicles, or utility infrastructure, where you're saving a little bit each year towards the replacement costs. This means when the time to replace the town truck or dig up the road comes, you don't have to bond or go to town residents asking for a large increase in taxes. So it can be a good fiscal practice, although it can be, depending on the size of your community and your ability to develop and maintain that list, it may or may not be appropriate for you. Um, but it is a good option for many communities, and those can be prepared by the Planning Commission or Select Board, although they are always approved by the Select Board. And then finally, as I noted, there's opportunities to collaborate with other commissions and committees, like housing committees, which may look at housing needs assessments and education and advocacy around housing, energy committees, which may support enhanced energy planning, and also advise on energy or climate elements of capital planning, conservation commissions, which often do natural resource inventories and may manage town forest or conservation areas, and recreation committees, which also tend to manage and plan for recreation areas as well as recreation programming. So I think the most important thing to take away is don't get overwhelmed if you're working on planning in your communities, and please reach out to the RPCs for assistance. Um, that's what we're here to do, is to provide technical assistance to your communities and help you move through these planning processes. And I've included here again, on the presentation that's sent out, will actually link to the emails of each of the folks on the planning team at NRPC, which is myself, Greta, and Luke, as well as our phone numbers there. And I will open it up as well to any questions. Great. Feel free to continue to put any question in the chat or come off mute if you'd like. And I'm also going to try this. I've not done this before, so I apologize if it doesn't work. I have a feedback form for the presentation that I'm going to attempt to launch into Zoom. Um, and if you are able to fill that out, that would be very helpful to us as well. Hopefully you're seeing that now.
Nope, I think I missed one. I did have a quick question. I'm up in Enosburg,
Mhm.
and our zoning is. I'm on here mostly for zoning stuff, because we're
Yep.
kind of a weird thing with the town and the village.
Mhm.
Maybe my questions would be better off offline, but it's hard to figure out who's in charge and where the rules are coming from up here sometimes, because it's a little convoluted and there's some
Yep.
gray areas. I guess my question is, like, what's the best avenue to get a better grasp on that? I know you said your zoning thing is on the 28th. I may not be able to make that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm happy to, if you want to set up a time to meet offline as well. It certainly can be a challenging issue with the interactions between like a village and a town.
Hmm.
Generally, when you have like in the case of your town plan, for example, which is merged, when the town adopts the plan, if the village doesn't go out of their way to adopt a separate plan, that plan is considered as covering both the town and the village.
Hmm.
But in the case of, for example, your zoning currently, you currently have two separate zoning bylaws. So because the village chose to adopt a different zoning bylaw, those two are now separate, where the town's bylaw has authority in the town and the village bylaw has authority in the village. Um, in
Hmm.
terms of staff, I think that is a good place to have some sort of written agreement, just to make sure that it's clear, because that can be Um, that's a little bit of
Hmm.
a murky water in terms of like who's appointing the zoning administrator, for example, where you have separate zoning
Right? Because I think our
bylaws.
zoning administrator, I think he works for us, but he's
Mhm.
paid by the town, and the town kind of has its zoning, and we follow it. Its bylaws.
Yeah, well, currently I believe the village has its own bylaw. I know there is a draft bylaw that would merge the two, but it hasn't been
Hmm.
adopted yet.
Gotcha.
Um, so yeah, that is generally if if the in a case where you have a town and an incorporated village, if the village takes no action, then the town's planning would apply to the village. But in the case of, for example, the bylaws where the village had previously taken action and adopted a separate bylaw, um, that then becomes the bylaw for the village.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I mean, maybe some more offline stuff later on, but
Yep. Yeah,
uh,
absolutely. Feel free
is your
to reach
email
out.
available?
Yes, yep. I can put it in the chat here and it will also be in the presentation. It's linked in the presentation we're going to send out after the fact, but I'll put it in the chat here as well.
Okay, that's fine. I appreciate it. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, no worries.
Hi, um, I'm just curious, are there things that there shouldn't be in the plan?
I think there are, things that you can get bogged down in, like you can get overly bogged down in a lot of data and information about what's happened in the past. Um, and that can just
Why would you bring that up?
yeah, yeah, you can get bogged down in that and not end up doing the things that you should do in terms of focusing on the future and focusing on what's going to be implemented. I think also it's worth thinking of, are there things that are best served that aren't a required part of the plan that are better served as a separate document in terms of um, if there is like a project list, for example, might be something that you want to update yearly, and it's worth thinking about the fact that your plan is kind of gets put into amber. You can obviously amend it, but that process that requires a planning commission hearing and 1 to 2 select board hearings with timelines associated with those, it can take minimum 60 days to update, and there's some cost associated with doing the hearing notices. So sometimes you can think of, okay, is this particular piece of information something that's going to be true for 8 years, most likely, or at least for 5 years? Or is it something that, we want to keep as a separate document for our own purposes where we can update it more regularly and just reference it in the plan as we have this project list or something like that? Um, that's a thing to think about, I think.
Well, something I was thinking about it, I think you said that everything that you have in the plan should have an implementation strategy, which that can be difficult sometimes. It's easy to identify problems and harder to come up with
Yeah.
solutions.
Yeah, and it's not necessarily that every single goal that you have to have a direct implementation strategy. I think that, sometimes you can have things that are aspirational and just identify that there are challenges to reaching it that way. Um, so I certainly think it's better to have a tighter list of actions that are things you think you could actually get done and that you can really prioritize than the sort of kitchen soup list of all of the things that we would love to do when you know that some of those things, are not feasible because of budget, because of time, because of buy-in from the community, whatever it is. Um,
Right,
I think, those things can maybe stay in your goal if they're part of your community's goal, but they might not uh, filter down to that level depending on, obviously there are some things communities have more control over than others.
right.
Yes,
But
Neil.
it sounds like there isn't really a limit. Like if the planning board decides that something's important and they have a plan
Yep.
to fix it, then it could be in there.
Yeah, yeah, there's no like set things that absolutely, I mean, other than things that are illegal or something like that. But yeah,
Right,
if, for example, like things such as community health or climate aren't necessarily directly required to be addressed in your plan, but a lot of communities choose to um, address those areas within their plan. Um,
Like,
So
I don't
that
think it's relevant here, but things that I thought of were substance abuse or crime or speeding or, traffic fatalities or, so,
absolutely. Yeah, those are things that some communities do address in their plans, even though they're not necessarily like part of those required plan elements. Um,
right.
so yeah, you can address areas that aren't necessarily directly a required element, but that are important to a community and relate to, I think, if they relate to what you're going to do in terms of planning and implementing that plan.
Yeah. Okay.
And Neil, yes, you can get a copy of the Vermont Planning Manual. When I send the presentation out, it's actually linked in there, but I can also attach it separately in that email. Any other questions? Not seeing any. I'll give it another minute or two. And, oh,
I guess one last question. Do you guys keep a library of like good plans or, samples?
You can see in terms of you can see all the plans in our region on our webpage, so that can be an interesting way to kind of look through. We don't have any like specific example plans, but there are some in that municipal planning manual that they've picked as sort of example plans
Okay.
uh, at the state level. Great. Well, if there aren't any other questions, can get finished a few minutes early tonight, which is always good.